Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's broadcast, we will treat one of the most familiar and correspondingly most famous episodes in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. Can anything new or fresh be offered about this extremely well-known story? As always, the details and the context might make the difference. Let's take another look at Genesis 11, where the story is narrated. The beginning of the story is startling, but familiar nevertheless. The whole world had only one language. Even more amazing, the vocabulary was limited in that this one language only used a few words. That's in verse 1 of chapter 11. Were that situation not sufficiently incredible, it appears that everyone on the planet occupied the same space. These people migrated from the east and settled in a plain in the land of Shinar. That's in verse 2. With everyone living in such close proximity and using a single language with a small vocabulary, communication would have posed no problem whatsoever. Indeed, the people living in this plain immediately decided to put their proximity and ease of communication to good use. They said to each other that they should make bricks and fire them well, something that was common to do in brick making. That's in verse 3. Using the bricks instead of stones, along with bitumen that could be used as mortar, would facilitate building. In fact, the people planned to use these materials to build a city with a very tall tower. Such an impressive project would ensure that they would make a name for themselves. The people reasoned that a project on this scale would allow them to stay in the same place rather than being scattered abroad on the face of the earth. That's in verse 4. Why they were so concerned to stay in one place is not immediately apparent. In any case, before the project got off the ground, so to speak, God takes a look at what is going on in the plain of Shinar. Upon seeing the newly built city and tower, God is displeased. The deity opines that, given that they are one people with a single language, there is no limit to what these folk might do. That's in verses 5 and 6. Evidently, God saw this activity as arrogant and overreaching. To prevent another scheme like this, God decides to confuse the language so that easy communication is no longer possible. However, not only did God make communication difficult, but the deity also scattered the people over the face of the earth, something that they had tried to avoid by building the city and the tall tower in the first place. No longer is everyone in the same place, and no longer is there only one language to lubricate communication. That's in verse 8. The episode concludes with a little editorial remark, namely, that the place was henceforth named Babel because God had confused the language that the people used. There is a pun between the Hebrew word for confuse and the city name Babel. That is the famous story in a nutshell. But if one extends the context just a little, new light is shed on this mythic account. You will perhaps not be surprised when I tell you that over the years, when I taught this story in the university or the seminary, my students thought there was a problem with how the chapters were numbered. In short, my students thought that the Babel story, should have occurred in Genesis 10 and the contents of Genesis 10 would have made sense as chapter 11. Why did my students offer this suggestion as a way of improving the biblical order? Here's why. Genesis 10 is sometimes called the Table of Nations. In this chapter, we learn that Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, formed the population groups of the whole world. Each of the three sons were responsible for numerous descendants who settled in different places throughout the world, each having distinctive cultures and differing languages. These peoples were spread out in every possible region, and each was distinct from each other. That is what is so jarring about the beginning of Genesis 11, where we learn that everyone was in the same place, spoke the same language, and did not have many vocabulary words to learn. The logic was simple. Genesis 11 explains the very situation that one encounters in Genesis 10. Why in the world did not the original editors of the biblical material not see what was so very obvious? Well, it is obvious that the division of natures, cultures, venues, and languages should come after the Babel story rather than preceding it, but only if it must be read sequentially. The situation is entirely different if the two chapters are to be read more or less simultaneously. In that case, they are mirror images of a good scattering and a bad scattering. Just as the people in the plain of Shinar did not want to be scattered, a fate they finally realized at God's hand, that's in verses 4 and 8 of chapter 11, the scattering that is described in Genesis 10, especially in verse 18, is not a sign of God's displeasure, but a fulfillment of God's original command to be fruitful and fill the earth way back in Genesis 1, verse 28. The word for scatter is the same in both chapters 10 and 11. In other words, the problem of the people in the plain of Shinar was their arrogance, their hubris. They wanted their city and tall tower to be magnificent so that they could make a name for themselves. That is, instead of using their proximity and ease of communication for the common good, however that might have been defined, they instead used this wonderful advantage for self-aggrandizement. God put a stop to it. Still, one cannot leave the Babel story simply as an instance of human pride gone wrong. In a sense, the episode is also a linchpin. Indeed, it has a strategic place in Genesis 1 through 11. Beginning with Genesis 3, when the man and the woman ate the forbidden fruit, sin grew among the human family. In fact, sin grew exponentially. After the sin in the garden, Cain killed his brother Abel. Before long, the sons of God married the daughters of men in Genesis 6. Originally, this story was likely a vestige of an old myth in which divine beings coveted human beings and intermarried with them illicitly. In its present context, though, the sons of God probably are represented primarily by Cain's genealogy, whereas the daughters of men represented Seth's genealogy. In any case, this unholy union made God regret the whole creation project, at least in terms of the human component. This outrageous behavior prompted God to destroy almost everything in the great flood. Even after the flood was over, however, sin continued. One of Noah's sons looked on his nakedness as he lay down drunk. Likely that was a euphemism for some sort of untoward sexual behavior. The last act of sin occurred when the people of Shinar built the city with the big tower. Of course, each act of sin was accompanied by an act of divine judgment. The sin in the garden led to increased pain in childbirth, the curse on the ground, and the serpent's having to crawl on its belly, not to mention the expulsion of the couple from the garden. Cain was condemned to wander around, thus preventing him from farming, his chosen profession. As mentioned, the sin involving the sons of God and the daughters of men led to the great flood, perhaps the greatest act of divine judgment in all the Bible. Noah cursed his grandson after his own son had done something terribly wrong. And the sin committed in the plain of Shinar led to a divine judgment in which the people were scattered against their will and found it impossible to communicate. These were dire punishments, but they were not God's final actions. Each of the judgments were followed by a corresponding act of grace. In the garden story, God clothed the man and the woman. They did not die immediately and continued their life outside the garden. Those are acts of grace. Even though Cain killed his brother, God put a mark on him so that he would not undergo capital punishment. That was an act of grace. In the great flood, God made a provision to save the descendants of Seth, all of whom were on the ark, along with the other animals that were saved. That also was an act of grace. After Noah cursed his grandson, his 3 sons were blessed to populate the entire earth, as we saw in Genesis 10. That also was an act of grace. Only Babel did not have a corresponding act of grace. Why? Because the whole rest of the biblical story was the act of grace following the Babel story. Here is my rationale for saying that. The Babel story is followed by the genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's sons. Shem is also the Hebrew word for name. Right after that genealogy, we enter the story of Abraham and Sarah. Name is important in that story too. As it turns out, a name was at issue in the Babel account, as you'll recall. The people at Shinar wanted to build a city and a tower to make a name for themselves. God was not against the people making a name for themselves if done properly and for the right reasons. But that was not what the people in Shinar had in mind. They were prideful and could not, because of that, complete their project. The very next story after Shem's genealogy, God brought up this business of a name again. When the deity summoned Abraham and Sarah, among other things, God said that they would have a great name. God would see to that. That's in verse 2 of chapter 12 of Genesis. This great name would be part of a grand blessing. The couple would become a great nation, would be amazingly blessed, would in turn be a blessing to others, and in addition have a great name. Eventually, God says, by Abraham and Sarah, all the families of the earth will be blessed by what God is going to do through this couple. That story includes the establishment of Israel as God's people and, so Christians believe, includes also the story of Jesus. The whole story of salvation as narrated in the Bible is the act of grace following the Babel story. It may be that a New Testament writer saw this story in precisely these terms. This writer described an event that may be seen as Babel in reverse. This writer described an event in which people from all over the known world had gathered in one place, namely Jerusalem. Of course, they all spoke different languages. But when God's Spirit showed up, communication was no longer a problem. Miraculously, everyone could understand everyone else, the very opposite of what had happened in Babel. That event, of course, was Pentecost, as the story is told in the book of Acts, chapter 2. That was some act of grace following the Babel story. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can communicate with you with our mini courses. I am almost done with the year's menu of the mini courses that are going to be offered, from which you can choose either to take 1 or 2 or 3 or all 12. Also, if you have other questions you would like me to address in a future Q&A session, ask me the question at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.